Whistle Test began on the 21st of September 1971. The television service at that time, in terms of rock and pop music, was very different to the one that we know today. There was only Top of the Pops. Top of the Pops, as always, featured the top 20, and so the only music you ever heard from the popular market was the band's singles. There was never a chance to hear any of their album material. And you have to bear in mind that at that time the album market was very strong, and in many cases stronger than the singles market. So there was an enormous wastage of good music going on. We had recognised that a couple of years earlier and created a programme called Colour Me Pop, which took individual bands and gave them a 25-minute slot and featured music from either their latest or their biggest album. So we'd embraced the idea that album music was around. That lasted for one season, and we then brought in another programme called Disco 2, which actually wasn't a disco-type programme at all. It was just a title that seemed to fit at the time, even if the product within it was not quite as described with the word disco. It was a continuation of album music, but it was presented in such a way that it was a little bit more hip for the time. And that, in turn, led to the arrival of the Old Grey Whistle Test. It was, in fact, a sort of spawning ground where we experimented with various ideas. I'd had for quite a while in my mind the idea of doing NME or Melody Maker on television, a magazine programme, the sort of thing that never existed before. And it seemed to me that there was at that time a place on television for something that could look at rock music, particularly in a slightly more serious way than Top of the Pops looked at pop music. So I began to set about thinking how we could put a magazine programme on television. And one of my initial thoughts that became one of the rules of the programme was that the people who were going to present it were basically going to be journalists. They were going to be people who knew their subject matter. And they were people who were going to be doing presentation on television as a hobby rather than as a career, so that they never became bigger than the programme. The programme was always the leading light. Whoever was on it and whoever was doing it, musicians in the programme were what it was about, not about career building for journalists. And this, I think, worked very well all the way through, even to the extent that our first presenter left us after the first series because he decided that his journalism was too pressing, and that's Richard Williams, and that he was going to leave to write a book as well as continuing his journalistic career. But it nevertheless, as a yardstick, I think worked well, and at no time really in all the years that Whistle Test existed did we have any sort of prima donnas who were presenting the programme. And one has to bear in mind that at that time, very many of the music magazines rather tended to put their writers in sort of bigger print than they did the actual people they were writing about. It was very much the beginning, I suppose, of celebrity writing, and I didn't want it to become a celebrity television programme. So we started to plan Whistle Test. As I say, it had come out of both Colour Me Pop and Disco 2, and we had to decide first of all, on what title the new programme would have. We decided that Disco 2 hadn't been the most appropriate title, so we wanted one that was going to last. I had the idea that a magazine programme could last quite a long while. Magazines can bend with the wind and they can change with circumstance, particularly if the magazine format is the main thing rather than any particular theme within it. The only principle that we had to lay down was that it was an album programme. Top of the Pops looked after the singles, so we were going to devote ourselves to only album material. Now, some of the material on there might have been singles, but they will always have been singles that were featured on an album. And then we had to think of a title. And this did cause quite a lot of soul-searching. We nearly had Florence Foster Jenkins' Musical Emporium as a title. Thank God we didn't, because I think that would have lasted about 5 minutes. It came out of an office that was full of people working on a programme called Late Night Lineup. And we all sat around. And one of the people in the office, named Gloria Wood, was living at the time with Jake, the drummer from Quintessence. And she said, "Why don't you call it the Old Grey's Whistle Test?" And we all looked somewhat askance, not knowing really what the hell she was talking about. And then she explained that in the old days of Tin Pan Alley, when they were selling really not records so much as selling sheet music, but nevertheless the records were out, they would take the first pressings and they would play them to the people they called the old greys, who were usually the sort of doormen, the delivery men, and they were called the old greys because they were older and their hair was going grey. And if after a couple of hearings of the record they could whistle the melody, then they thought potentially they had a hit song. Not so much a hit song in terms of selling the record, but a hit song in terms of selling the sheet music. And this was known as the Old Greys Whistle Test, which was a bit of a mouthful, so we took the S off the end of grey, and it became the Old Grey Whistle Test. And we thought, well, that's a fairly enigmatic title. If it's going to be a long-lasting programme, then you can probably live with that as a long-lasting title. You won't grow tired of it, because people will always wonder what the hell it means. So having then established the title that we were going to work with, we then had to get some opening titles for the programme made. And I had all sorts of ideas, and I contacted Roger Ferrin, who was our designer in the BBC at the time, and gave him an outline of what we wanted. And he came back a few days later with something totally different, infinitely better. And the famous whistle test Star Kicker was born. I'm not quite sure where he got his name. Well, I know why he got his name Star Kicker, because obviously the design, but who actually coined him Star Kicker, I don't know, but that was his name, and he very soon was known to everybody by that name. And out of it we created the famous whistle test badges, but more of that later on. So, having got opening titles and a title, we had to go about probably the most important thing, and that was finding a presenter. And I wanted somebody who was a journalist, who knew his subject matter, who wouldn't have to be briefed all the time, wouldn't have to have masses of research done by somebody else, who could call on natural knowledge, particularly if you're doing interviews. I hate people looking down at bits of paper and things and checking up on things. A good interview is a conversation where all the points are just picked up naturally. And so I looked around for a journalist who had either broadcasting experience or had potential broadcasting experience, and who was respected by musicians. And at the time I thought this was exactly the mantle that fitted Richard Williams, who was at that time, I believe, assistant editor on Melody Maker. And he was certainly a senior figure in Melody Maker and certainly well respected. So I approached Richard actually slightly earlier, at the end of Disco 2, and asked him to do a couple of items to camera into Disco 2. And I don't think he knew it, but it was actually an on-air audition, because in those days one didn't have time to sort of go and get audition rooms and things like that. One was too busy, and you could get away with it on the air. And Richard fitted the bill well, and I offered it to him, and he was, I wouldn't say he was sort of absolutely convinced that he was the right person and wanted to do it, but I think he was intrigued enough. He always made it plain that his first love was journalism, and he wasn't there to become a television star. And this was actually what I was looking for, as I said before, because I didn't want somebody to come along to become the star of the show and put the actual whistle test in the background. So we started out with Richard on our first series, but that in itself had a sort of strange hiccup that one, I suppose, should have foreseen but didn't. He decided to get married, which is a fairly normal, natural thing to do. But unfortunately, he decided to go abroad on honeymoon, and that honeymoon period covered the first 2 weeks of transmission. So here we were, we had a programme, we had opening titles, we had a presenter, but unfortunately the presenter wasn't going to be there for the first 2 weeks. This was a sort of bit of a dilemma, but not a total dilemma, because he wasn't the only presenter. We also had Ian Whitcomb, who was going to be a sort of reporter into it. Ian was an ex-musician, had had hit records in other parts of the world, toured with some of the big bands, and was a big friend of Jack Good, who was a very well-known television producer at the time. And he seemed an ideal person with contacts and things and would fit the bill. So I didn't worry too much about Richard going on his honeymoon. And in fact, to make up for it, we pre-recorded a couple of pieces for the first 2 weeks. It just so happened that the National Film Theatre were doing a big retrospective on rock in film, and this was an ideal situation with plenty of film clips of sort of real rock and roll stars, the Chuck Berrys, the Buddy Hollys, the great names of early American rock and roll that have been featured in films. And so we put together 2 items, one for each week. And then the idea was that Ian would do the rest of the linking and the interviews on the live programmes, because it was live. Anyway, come the day of the first programme, 21st of September 1971, all was going reasonably well. The only slight problem was that Ian seemed to be developing a bit of a stutter. He was known to have a slight stutter, but it seemed to be getting worse. And I was beginning to get a little nervous, because here we were, our first programme, a new hip rock and roll programme. The main presenter wasn't there, although we could cover that up and not necessarily let people know by the pre-recordings. But our main presenter seemed now as though he's going to stutter through the presentation. And I got progressively more and more worried, and I took Ian aside and said, "Look, Ian, I'm really worried about this. What do you think?" And he said, "Don't worry, don't worry. I'll get it right. It's pre-nerves. I won't have any trouble when we actually get into the studio for a live transmission." And I thought, "Oh God, what am I going to do?" And I took the rather sort of bold step to decide that I was going to take it away from Ian, and I was going to present the programme myself. Now, this was something that I'd never done before, apart from very slight sort of dalliance many years before on radio in Bristol, and that had been fairly sort of undramatic, but as everything had to be scripted, even any coughs and splutters had to be scripted, so I wasn't really used to this sort of thing. But on the other hand, I reckoned if I was out of vision and making the announcements and introductions, Ian was left to do the interview in the studio. Richard was there for the studio links for the film lot. We could probably get away with it. And in fact, we did get away with it. It meant right up until the last minute we were having to readjust timings because, as I said, nobody was in vision. So we had to carry over from one sequence to the next with something visually either attractive or keeping some continuity going. So we butt joined a lot of things, and I talked over in true disc jockey fashion. And we actually got away with it. And what's more, I guess Richard and I had not dissimilar voices, because nobody ever knew that it was me. They thought it was Richard. And it was a style of presentation that we decided to adopt. And as I say, we got away with it. And 2 weeks after, Richard came back in and everything carried on normally. And incidentally, Ian didn't stutter at all. He was right. But it was just, I thought, too big a risk to take at the time. So there we were, full complement, back to normal. And normal in those days meant everything live. We did have the facility to record a small section in the afternoon, and this was really born out of necessity, because the studio that we'd inherited was a very small studio that was really intended only for links between programmes by presenters, and had been designed actually for one person. So there we were trying to put a whole rock and roll programme into this tiny little cubicle that was meant for one person and a bunch of flowers. So the only way we could get round it and make it look as though there was any size to the programme was by pre-recording one sequence in the afternoon and then playing that into the evening, and the whole evening was live. Now, this had some definite advantages, because we were at the back end of BBC Two, the last programme, and in those days it was fairly early BBC Two, and some people used to think of it as a sort of rather quiet, sleepy club, in a way, the way they talk about Channel 5 now, a very limited number of viewers. And this was to our advantage, because we could sort of probably get away with things that we might not get away on a mainstream channel. And it also meant that we weren't really constricted in time. So the programme could run to what we would judge was its right duration, either slightly shorter than build or slightly longer than build, and invariably it was usually slightly longer than build. But it gave us an enormous freedom. But one of the disadvantages was that we couldn't always get a videotape machine to record us off air. So there are some price list performances which are in the ether somewhere and never committed to tape at any time. And it's only when you go back and look at it from an archival point of view that you realise that there were certain things, like, for instance, the first appearance of Judy Sill, that was a wonderful appearance, but we don't have it. And it was great, because in those days, as I said, we slightly thought we were a sort of a minority club of sort of word-of-mouth viewers, and Judy Sill was there playing the piano, And she did 2 songs, and she was live. And in between the 2 songs, she turned around and said, "The producer doesn't know I'm going to say this, but I wish you'd go out and buy my record, because I'm fed up backing snotty-nosed pop groups." And then went into her next song. And the next day, we got a sort of buzz from people who had seen it, and suddenly we realised that, small as the club was, there was still quite a high percentage because they'd actually seen this, and it had stirred them enough to comment about it. But as I say, everything was live, and there were great advantages to that. I mean, musicians had that little bit extra edge on them. They knew that whatever they did when it was going out, and if they mucked it up, they mucked it up. I mean, no different to performing a live gig on a stage, except that the stage they were playing on had a far bigger audience than any auditorium they'd ever played before. And for the most part, I think it worked out really well. A television studio can be quite intimidating if you're not used to it. Back in the early 70s, bands weren't really used to it. They only really had opportunities if they had a single in the top 20. Otherwise, they wouldn't have really seen the inside of a television studio at all. So we had to find a way of making the Whistle Test studio as welcoming and as familiar as we possibly could. So we made a positive decision not to have a set. This was beneficial actually in 2 ways, not only for the artists, who would then sort of look at it much more like a rehearsal room than a television studio, but it also meant that the studio, which was extremely small, just for a speaker really between programmes, it meant that if we didn't have any scenery, we had the maximum amount of room to use. And in many ways, our biggest bugbear in those early days was the limitations the studio imposed upon us. The mixing desk for sound was laughable. It had 8 faders, and if you had echo on one, you had to have echo on all of them. It hadn't been designed for music. It hadn't been designed for anything other than the spoken word. And so we had to make ourselves adaptable, and the bands had to make themselves adaptable. And as a consequence, some looked upon this as a challenge, some looked upon it as a nightmare. And we had to really work out who could do what, where and when. There were quite a number of singer-songwriters at that period of time, and that was easy. We could cover them easily and professionally. But there were certain bands that it was very difficult. I mean, if you get hold of The Who came in this period, it was very difficult to contain them in that circumstance. And so there were cases where miming was employed. We never really wanted any miming, but we had to succumb in, because we could see the impossibility of reproducing the sound that had been created in a sound studio with all the professional equipment that they had. But we would almost invariably, and I say almost invariably because there were just a few exceptions, we would put live vocals on. So there was a performance, a part performance, even if it wasn't total the performance. And this way we were able to overcome most of the problems the studio presented. But because of the size, we could never have 2 bands in there, so we used to have to pre-record one in the afternoon, and the second one was live in the evening. And this situation really stayed for quite a long time. And then one wonderful day, Edgar Winter and his band turned up to do Frankenstein, and they brought with them a sub-mixer. Now, you know, this was like the icing on the cake for us. And the joke was that there were more outputs on the sub-mixer than there was on the total studio. But this sub-mixer was fed into one fader, and then we had another 5 or 6 still to play with. And we got a remarkable sound out of the studio, really, I think, for a band of that size and that volume. I guess for the first time ever, and it left everybody feeling really good afterwards, and the band as well. And seeing it now, after all this time in between, it's difficult sometimes to realise that it actually was live sound. We'd always worked on the principle that wherever possible, sound took priority, because after all, that's what record making was about. And as a consequence, we used to have sound guys in the Beeb queuing up to do Whistle Test, because they were actually the ones given the priority, whereas in most productions they were the also-rans who had to keep up with the pace of the vision side. This was a challenge for them, and a challenge that really appealed. And we pioneered to a certain extent the collaboration between the band sound men and the BBC sound men, or women, although in those days I think they were probably exclusively men. It had been a case of sort of jealously guarding their territories, the BBC's sound men, and not allowing any exterior help to come in. But we found that if a band went into a studio and spent 3 months trying to put an album together, and then our man in the studio had to recreate that sound in one afternoon, A, it wasn't fair on the band, and B, it wasn't fair on our sound man. And by combining the expertise of the band's sound man with our own, we managed to get very often remarkably good sound. It didn't always work, and there were a few bust-ups, but by and large it grew into a respect from both sides that benefited the band, the programme, and the general output. One of the other limitations that we had to go alongside the sound problems was a lack of visual material being produced from other sources. The promotional video had not come anywhere near into existence. We were an album programme, and at that time American material was fairly dominant in the albums, and therefore in many cases the music that you wanted to feature, which was the best music at that moment, was from American bands who weren't on tour, and if they weren't in the country and there wasn't any visual material. And up to that time, you had to bear in mind that probably almost exclusively any visual material that had been produced had been produced by the Beatles with their films like Penny Lane. We had to find a way, somehow, of featuring this music. We had to invent, I suppose, our own videos. And this we did with the help of Philip Jenkinson and his film archive. Phil and I worked together quite a lot on other programmes, principally a programme called Film Night, which went on to become the main film programme on BBC television. He had an extensive archive of film, and so I asked him if he would try and put together some visualisation to some tracks as an experiment to see whether we could incorporate this into the programme. Apart from giving it another dimension, the whole programme, it meant that suddenly bands that had no hope in hell of getting on the programme could suddenly be featured, even if it was only their music, and principally that's what the bands were about anyway. So it seemed a good idea. And Phil went away and created a whole genre of television visualisation that many people say actually opened the door and was a very early form of the pop video. And it became an established part of the programme, to the extent that there were people who tuned in as much to see these film interpretations that Phil put together as they did to see the bands performing in the studio. And this went on for the whole duration of the programme until it finished in 1987 and became, as I say, one of the more attractive parts. It led in the end to promo videos being produced by record companies. In those days, it meant that if we had a video in the programme, it was one that we had created ourselves, and the only place you could see it was on Whistletest. So it gave us an exclusivity, which meant if you don't watch Whistletest, you won't see this. Whereas in the later stages, it was a race between different programmes to see who could have the first transmission of a video. And in the end, if you missed the first transmission, you could see the second or the third or the fourth, because it would be in a variety of different programmes, kids' programmes like Swap Shop and the like, or any number of programmes. And so that exclusivity that created an allegiance to the programme was gradually whittled away. In creating these videos, Phil established some particular marriages of picture and music that have enormous longevity, and to this day, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield is really difficult for me to separate from his visualisation, which was a very old black and white skiing film filmed by Leni Riefenstahl, who later went on to be Hitler's principal documentarian of the grandeur of the parades of the Nazi period in Germany. And there were others. I mean, Trampled Underfoot by Led Zeppelin. One of the problems was that Led Zeppelin never did television, either in the States or in the UK. It was a principle that had been put down by Peter Grant, their manager, and I guess it gave them a sort of mystical appeal because people could only see them in concert, never saw them anywhere else. And so if we wanted to feature their music, we had to, again, create our own visuals. And Phil Jenkinson put together a remarkable dance sequence taken from various songs to Trampled Underfoot. And to this day, I can watch it time and time again and never tire of it. It was this, as much as the rest of the presentation of music, that helped build up the following for Whistletest. Having established Phil Jenkinson's role within Whistletest, we then found other people became interested in possibly supplying material to us. And one particular one I remember, a guy called Ian Eames, who was an instructor in an art school. And part of one of the projects that he'd been working on was to create some visual images for Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And he sent this animation in to us, and it was so good and so impressive that I wrote back and asked him, can we put it on the programme? And he said, yeah, by all means. And we put it on. And as a result of it, someone in the Pink Floyd outfit was watching the programme, saw it, contacted Ian via us. He was commissioned then to make more visual material for Floyd. This was then used successfully in their tour on the stage projections. And he then began an association with Pink Floyd, which lasted for a long time. And he became a sort of member of the group. And his visuals became very much identified with them. One of the nice things about working in television in those days, back in the 70s, was the intimacy. The sort of barriers hadn't yet been built up between the public or the artists and the production crew. I mean, we had a very small production crew of 4 people. Whistletest was run by 4 people, a director, a producer, a researcher, and a production secretary. And if an artist or member of the public wanted to find something out, they would just ring straight through and we would pick up the phone, and we wouldn't know whether it was going to be Joe Bloggs from Harwell or whether it was going to be Mick Jagger. It was a sort of open line to anybody who wanted to find anything out, which almost sounds impossible in this day and age where there are so many filters and so many barriers between the person you really want to get to, who knows the answer, and the member of the public or the artist phoning in. But then everything was sort of small in those days. Our budgets were small. It's almost inconceivable to think that each programme had to be put together for £500. When I think about it, it just makes nonsense. But then you would get an artist, the stature of, for instance, David Bowie. He would come in and he would perform 3 songs for £50. Now, it sounds crazy, but that's just how things were in those days. We all worked together within our own limitations. They understood our financial limitations, and this was the way we could keep ourselves going and keep our heads above water and feature the sort of music that generally wasn't particularly of interest to the hierarchy of the BBC. We were a very convenient valve, so to speak, for many heated people who come on and say, why aren't you featuring more of this popular rock music? They could then point over to Whistletest and say, well, that's where that's going on. And while they continued with the more commercially successful music. So it was a nice intimate setup with a good relationship. For instance, Mick Jagger, if he was coming in to be on the programme, and I pick him because this is a particular case I remember. Instead of turning up as one might expect, particularly in this day and age, with a load of sort of support staff, limos and things, would actually just walk in on his own to the main reception at Television Centre and just phone up to the studio and say, I've arrived, can somebody come down and show me the way to get there? And they come in, do an interview, come backstage after the programme to a hospitality room, have a quick drink and then buzz off on his own afterwards. It was a nice sort of feeling of lack of pressure really going on. And because of that, the interviews tended to be much more intimate and much more friendly. I mean, sometimes the interviews didn't work, as in certain cases where, rock stars aren't necessarily going to be the greatest interviewees in the world. But I always worked on the principle that the people who were fans just would like to see them talking. There was nowhere else they were going to see them. There weren't all the sort of interview programmes that there are now. There weren't all the kids' programmes, which are sort of fighting for people to come on and talk. The only place at that time was on Whistletest, and therefore the fact that they weren't the most articulate didn't actually matter, because this was your chance to see your hero in the flesh being spoken to by somebody and hearing what he had to say. One also has to remember, of course, that at the time when these people were coming in, not Jagger, because he was a big star, there were a lot of people who were in the ascendancy and subsequently became world stars. And when David Bowie came in, he was much respected, but he probably hadn't achieve the status that he was going to achieve a few years later. So that intimacy was probably helped with the fact that maybe they needed a little bit more exposure, and it was to their advantage. But it was nevertheless made for a very relaxed and intimate relationship, which in the long run expanded when they became more famous and gave us access to people where it might have been more difficult if we'd just come tramping in at that later stage of their career. There was always a risk factor with interviews because the people you were talking to were not known as talkers, they were known as performers, and one doesn't necessarily go hand in glove with the other. And very often somebody who on stage was extrovert and you'd think would be bubbling and full of vivacity ended up being somewhat morose and introspective and disappointing, whereas others that you thought might have something to say but probably not very much would suddenly throw off their cloak and expose themselves as extroverts who had an awful lot to say but not necessarily in performance on stage. So we had some interviews that were really quite disappointing, and we had others that we felt elated afterwards because they far exceeded our expectations. But then in those days there was not really very much chance to find out because there was not an opportunity to see them in any other programme or in any other circumstance. And unless you had time to go and meet them beforehand and talk to them, you really had no way of assessing them. And better to have got somebody to come on that you wanted and hope for the best. And if it didn't turn out that way, well, then that's the luck of the draw. Better that than say, oh, I can't risk it, I won't do it, and then at some later stage find out that they would have been really good. So there was always a risk factor in the interviews, and some of them were hilarious for all the wrong reasons. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and if you look at the quality of the artists on this DVD, you will see a number of truly world superstars. And yet one has to realise that when originally we were booking them back in the 70s, these in many cases were emerging artists. We had expectations of them, but we certainly weren't booking them as world superstars. And indeed, other ones that we booked didn't go on to become world superstars, but a high percentage did. And the quality of the artists and the quality of the bands coming through was something that we had to keep ourselves aware of as much as possible. And this meant listening to an enormous number of albums that were sent to us. And a lot of the time we were listening to things that had hopeful expectations, but you were pretty sure weren't going to make it. And the job was to sort the wheat from the chaff, really. And looking at the artists on this DVD, you can see that there were a large number that came through that we seemed to pick winners on. But it's very strange when you look at it now, and you remember that the first time Elton John was booked in the studio, he was just a young singer, musician, working with a lyricist, Bernie Taupin, and nobody could really predict that he was going to become Sir Elton John and a major universal music figure throughout the whole of the world. He obviously had the talent, but who could have predicted the way he went? And in fact, it hadn't been that much earlier that he'd had his first performance on Late Night Lineup, backing an American jazz singer, where he was booked as the Reg White Trio. So it's intriguing to see how artists have developed across the years. And those that you had faith in at one time have actually become the major figures that you thought they might do. But you certainly couldn't have said that they were. And when they were booked, they certainly weren't. Not only were artists booked on that level, but also tracks that we took off albums were taken in the same way. I remember receiving a white label. Now, a white label, for those who haven't been introduced to them, are the first test pressings that come from record companies without any details put on them. And they were used very often for promotional purposes, and they were sent to people who could be of use, presumably, to the artist or to the record company. And I received one day this white label, and it had been delivered when I wasn't in the office, and it was sitting on my desk. And I asked around if anybody had seen it. There were only 4 of us in the team, so there was a chance that one of them might have done, but nobody had seen anybody deliver it. And so I picked it up and put it on the turntable and thought, I like this. And I played more tracks, and I thought, I like this a lot. I'll give this to Phil Jenkinson and we'll put a visualisation to it. But the problem was we didn't know, A, where it had come from, or which label it was, or which artist it was. It was certainly a sound that I hadn't heard before, and it was very appealing, but I just couldn't get to the bottom of it. I couldn't find any hieroglyphics or any markings on the record to give me any indication at all. So I thought, well, I like it enough to put it in the programme, so we'll have to put it in anonymously. And what we did is we put it on and said, we really like this record. It came into the office this week. We've no idea who it is. If anybody out there is listening can tell us, please do, because we'd like to know who we're playing, as much as anything else for the music returns that have to go into the Performing Rights Society and the like. And the next day we got a call from EMI Records saying, oh, that's one of our new bands. It's a band called Queen. And we'd actually given Queen probably their first play, certainly their first play on television. The track was Keep Yourself Alive, and it got an enormous response. So the faith that we, as a programme, put in it was reflected in the way the viewers responded to it. But it's the only time, really, that I can remember we ever did anything quite so daring as that. For all the pleasure that something like Queen gave us in that track and discovering that band, there were also disappointments that we had. And one of the greatest disappointments for me personally was Steely Dan. People who know Steely Dan will know that of this period there is actually only one piece of film that exists of them doing Reeling in the Airs. Well, there should have been more. They were booked to come on to Whistle Test, and everything was set and they were coming in to record in the studio. And on the day before they were due to arrive, there was a lightning strike at the BBC and a picket line was put on the front gate. And we thought, oh, God, I hope this isn't going to last until tomorrow. But sure enough, it did last till tomorrow. And we thought, well, let's see if the driver will cross the picket line. And the band duly arrived at the gates of Television Centre, and they were in this big bus, and in the back of the bus were all the instruments and everything. Everything was self-contained. But the picket line wouldn't let them across and the driver wouldn't come across. And so there was the Whistle Test crew of 4 chafing at the bit on the inside of the Television Centre gates, and there was the band chafing at their bit on the outside, and this gulf between the two that was going to be insurmountable on this occasion. And we hadn't realised at the time. We thought, oh, well, we'll get them next time. So we yelled at them and said, hi, guys, look forward to seeing you next time. We'll have you in and we'll try and do a major number of songs, but this time we're going to have to kiss it goodbye, I'm afraid. And they waved and duly drove off. And, of course, they never came back again. And so we never had the opportunity to have Steely Dan in the studio. It's ironic that now in the year 2000 they're just winning Grammy Awards and things. And still, there's virtually no televisual material of them apart from Reeling in the Airs. But that's a disappointment, and you had to set that against the good times, where we've had things that were really successful. I've already mentioned that the album charts of the 70s was very much dominated by American bands, and therefore they were a large part of the Whistle Test output. And also that not many of them came over on tour, so the answer was if Mohammed couldn't get to the mountain would have to come to Mohammed. Or is it the other way round? Anyway, we decided, because Bob was already over in the States working for Radio 1 on the Beach Boys story, that this would be a good opportunity for me to go over and join him and get an interview with Brian Wilson. Now, Brian at that time had been very much a recluse for a long period of time, and all sorts of rumours were abounding about his mental health. And when we heard that he was prepared to be interviewed, it was an opportunity that we decided we couldn't miss. So I decided that I would join him out there and we would see how we could get on with an interview with him. It also coincided with a particularly bad time health-wise in that I put my back out and I had been producing Whistle Test. Because it was live on air, I could do it over the telephone, lying on an old door in the hall of my house. And so by the time the flight to the States came about, I was actually back on my feet, but only just. And I was walking with the aid of 2 walking sticks. So this didn't exactly look like a hip producer of a fairly new British rock programme, but I had no alternative, so I up sticks and went over to the West Coast and met up with Bob, and we then flew down to Los Angeles. Bob had just bought himself a new pair of boots, and he took them off in the plane, which was actually a fatal thing to do, because when he went to put them back on again, his feet had swollen up and he could only get one of them on. So there were these two people arriving from this rock show in the UK, the Top Rock Show. We hobbled down off the plane, me limping around on two walking sticks, and Bob with one shoe tucked under his arm and the other one on his foot, sort of limping along beside me. I can't imagine what impression it made on the people we were going there to meet. Anyway, the long and short of it was we got to meet Brian, and it was all done very carefully in under very organised situation. We sort of felt like we were being led around by interns in a hospital, and to a certain extent we found out afterwards that this was the case, because although we thought it was just another rock and roll interview, what in fact was happening is we were being used as part of Brian's recovery therapy. But we didn't know that at the time, and we only learnt it a long time afterwards. In the end, it worked. Whether it worked for Brian, I don't know, but for us it worked, because we got an interview with him. He was reasonably lucid, at times very lucid, and it managed to dispel some of the rumours about the state of his health at the time. Then that led really to more visits to the States in other years, because we found that we could do it on a reasonable shoestring. We developed a system of working whereby if we were shooting a band, we never had more than two cameras. So we would shoot the music once from two angles. We would then use the soundtrack the live soundtrack that we recorded, play it back, and then shoot the same thing with the band miming from two different angles, and use those as cutaways. Use the first live one as the principal shots, and the second two as cutaways to various instruments and things. And it actually worked rather well, because in the end it looked like a 4-camera shoot, which we could never ever afforded. That method of shooting proved quite successful, and it meant that artists who were riding high in the charts in the UK but not intending to come over to the UK could be featured. And then gradually the temperature changed and the climate changed, and they began to tour, and we were able to mix up and maybe go for the rather more obscure artists when we were filming, who were never going to come over but were of interest, and the mainstream ones we would get live in the studio whenever they came over on tour. When we made our initial forays into the American music scene, we were looked on rather like aliens from another planet. But as we became more intimate and more familiar with both American artists and managements, we were welcomed more and more warmly, until in the end, where we'd been chasing all the time to get artists were approaching us and saying, "Are you coming over? If you are, any chance that you'll be interested in filming the band? They're performing here, or they're doing this, or whatever." One of the interesting things that came up was in Macon in Georgia. That was the home of Capricorn Records. And every year, Phil Waldron, who used to run Capricorn Records, held this great big picnic in the open-air park there. And the bands performed, and it was very much a political animal as well, in that they raised funds for Jimmy Carter when he was governor of the state of Georgia. And this year was of particular interest, because this was the year that Jimmy Carter was no longer just the governor of Georgia. He was actually standing for president. He'd been nominated as the candidate for his party. And so he was coming to the show, the picnic, as he did each year, but he was coming in a slightly different capacity. And the interesting thing was that he had a mass of journalists and photographers and things with him. And television stations had sent crews along, because this particular day of the picnic was important, because it was the day he was going to learn who he was going to be running against. It turned out to be Ford. And the Ward and his wife was trying to get an interview with Carter, because now the two gladiators were in position, and this was the beginning of the countdown. And the weird thing was that the only interview that he gave all day was an interview to Whistle Test. He talked about rock and roll, and talked about particularly Bob Dylan and his influence on young people and things. And all the time, all the other journalists were coming around, "What did he say? What did he say? What did he have to say? Did he talk about Ford? Did he talk about himself or whatever?" And I said, "No, we're a rock and roll program. He was talking about rock and roll." And they really couldn't understand that he'd given his only interview of the day and his only time to us. And a side product of it was that we gave Jimmy Carter one of the whistle test buttons. Anybody who appeared on whistle test throughout its history was given a whistle test badge, and these became quite sought after at one stage. And anybody, as I say, interviewee or performer, was given a badge. And we gave this one to Jimmy Carter, and he pinned it on, and you can be seen in all the pictures at that time wearing it. But then when he started his presidential routine of picking up babies and kissing them and everything, he picked up one baby and impaled it on this whistle test badge, and there was blood and screaming everywhere. And so he turned around and gave it back to me and said, "I don't think this is quite the right thing for this occasion." So I have this cherished badge at home in my Holy of Holies to this day. But it was a fascinating experience. And what's more, the picnic itself was great because there were some really good bands playing there, good old Southern boys, Dickie Betts and Dwayne Allman, Greg Allman, Delaney and Bonnie, all artists at that time who were riding high in the sort of countrified rock charts. And we came back with a successful film, so successful that we had a call from Albert Grossman, who had been Dylan's manager, and had started his own record label, Bearsville, had people like Todd Rundgren on. And he said, "Look, we're going to throw one of these picnics. It looked really good next year. Would you like to come and film that?" And sure enough, we went up there and got some really interesting footage, particularly of Todd Rundgren and this amazing pyramid that he used to stand aloft playing his crystal guitar. Looking back to the 70s now with hindsight, it was an amazing time for the record companies because all the home entertainment that we have today, the videos, the computers, all the various games that can be played, none of those existed. So the home entertainment market was one great big juicy cake which had record company written over it, really. This was the home entertainment. And consequently, there was an enormous amount of money floating around. And record companies, I guess, were sort of looking at ways to spend their money before they paid it over to the taxman. And one of the ways that they spent it was in promoting all their new product. And there was an enormous amount of new product coming out. So they would hold receptions all over London in various venues. At one stage, you would have 5 days a week, a reception at lunchtime, and a reception in the evening that you could go to. And I remember at the time seriously suggesting to two guys who I think were working for CBS at that time that they should leave the promotion department and set up a company who could then by fax or by, I guess it might have been telex in those days, could contact people and tell them where the best receptions were because there were so many and you could quite easily miss them. So, I mean, when you look at the money record companies have today, it's very hard to believe it was like that at the time. And of course, Whistle Test being really the only programme at that time that was featuring album music and anything sort of outside of the top 20 was fated by all the record companies because it was important to them to get their product onto the programme because in many cases they were unknown bands who would be making their debut and rather like Top of the Pops does for top 20 single records still today. An appearance on Whistle Test could mean an enormous amount to them, both in recognition and potentially in sales. One of the byproducts of these receptions was that we got to meet colleagues working in the media, in radio and in television. Commercial radio like Capital Radio, BBC 2, BBC 1 and Radio 1. And strange as it may seem, when you actually work in your office, the interflow is very small. But when you get out of the offices and go into areas where you congregate, where somebody else brings you together, then the sort of talking starts. And you could get some idea of the buzz of different bands that were going on and what was interesting to some and what was interesting to others. And particularly you could note whether there were promotion people from other record companies attending, because that usually meant that the band that they come to see had some significance in the industry. Not necessarily always what you wanted, but it was an indicator. And other things that came out of these receptions were sort of byproducts that you wouldn't necessarily expect. For instance, we started the first stereo simulcasts via sort of conversations between Radio 1 and ourselves at Whistle Test. These led initially to Van Morrison at the Rainbow, which was the first ever stereo simulcast outside of the States. This was a concert that had been filmed. And at the time, Bob had his radio show on Radio 1 and he was fronting Whistle Test on BBC 2. And we decided this was something we could experiment with. Radio 1 was going out in stereo. Obviously, television was going out in mono, and here was an opportunity to experiment with a simulcast, and it worked really well. And that, in turn, led on to the first ever stereo simulcast anywhere in the world on a regular basis, and that was Sight and Sound in Concert. It was quite an interesting thing to do, Sight and Sound in Concert. It was Radio 1 and, once again, the Whistle Test crew. But because it was such an early time in experimentation in stereo, it meant that everything had to be produced as a live program. We didn't have, and it seems odd now with hindsight, we didn't have the ability to edit it because the soundtrack for the stereo signal was up at Broadcasting House, and the television mono track was attached obviously to the videotape down at Television Centre. And there was no way of synchronising edits over the two of them, even though you could bring them together into one building. Technology at that time wasn't there. Therefore, once you started the programme, it had to be as a live gig, which in itself is not a problem, but it's really frustrating if the artist makes a mistake and they know they've made the mistake, and you get to the end of the programme and there's nothing you can do about it. And as a consequence, there were times when we actually got 2/3 of the way through a concert, and some problem would come up that was too great to allow to go through, and we'd have to go right back to the top and start again. Thankfully, that was something that we got over quite quickly. But the first series, it was hanging over us every time. As a result of the success of our collaboration with Radio 1, we then started to look around and think, what else could we do that we could sort of chalk up as a first time? It became rather like wartime pilots, sort of ticking off planes they shot down. We wanted to tick off new experiences. And the next one we did was a transatlantic live concert from Madison Square Garden in New York. Jethro Tull were putting on a concert there. And we got the opportunity, because they were interested in the technology and they were interested in the band being seen in the UK, because at that time they weren't touring the UK and they had a new album out and they wanted it to be seen. We wanted to experiment with a transatlantic program. And so we covered this live concert. It was in the afternoon in New York and in the evening on BBC Two. And once again, it seemed to work very successfully. It didn't actually lead to any others, mostly because it was financially quite expensive, and Whistle Test was never a big budget program. But also at that time, and I suspect still to this day, New York was a very heavily union-oriented operation. Anything going on there, either in film or television, was very, very closely monitored by the unions there. And there was quite a lot of hassle going on, and quite honestly, the combination of the cost and the hassle didn't really make it a really worthwhile operation, although the actual one that we did, the Jethro Tull concert, was very successful. Another of the Whistle Test byproducts was a series called Rock Goes to College. And it's strange how things come about, how sort of needs must. We had the possibility of doing an in-concert series under the aegis of Whistle Test. But when it came to it, there were no studios available. There was limited studio space, and in the time frame that we could do Rock Goes to College when we weren't actually doing Whistle Test, there was no studios there for us to have. So we had to work out what we could do about this. Outside broadcast units were available, but then we had to find a venue. And I'd had, from many years ago, a Dave Brubeck album called Jazz Goes to College. And I thought, well, I know what we'll do. Why don't we go to the university campuses, if they've got halls there, and they can put us in there. We can bring a concert to them, and they can provide a venue, and they can provide an audience. So under the aegis of Rock Goes to College, as opposed to Jazz Goes to College, we went round to various universities, and for them, of course, it was a great opportunity because they were getting a free gig and we were getting a free venue, so it worked out really well. The success of Rock Goes to College did have a slight backfire in that it was a little bit like a cuckoo that had been born into the Whistle Test nest, and as it grew up and its importance became more obvious, bands tended to say, look, we'd rather come on to Rock Goes to College than do Whistle Test, for the obvious reason that they got a whole half-hour concert as opposed to two numbers. I had to knock this on the head at a fairly early stage, and I did this by saying that if a band had appeared on Whistle Test, then they would be eligible to appear on Rock Goes to College. But if they hadn't, then they wouldn't be. And the one exception to this was Midyear's new band that he formed with Glenn Matlock, the Rich Kids. And that was because they were put in as a last-minute replacement for the Stranglers after their abortive concert in Guildford. And the Stranglers actually hail from Guildford. And I think they were sort of taking us for a ride a bit in that when they got up on stage, they decided that they were going to make a protest, ostensibly because they said none of the good citizens and burghers of Guildford were allowed into this and only the privileged students were there. Now, there was no way they didn't know right from the beginning that this was the whole idea of Rock Goes to College, was that it was a college audience. And also that it was a free ticket allocation to members of that college. It wasn't a public concert. It never was intended to be a public concert. Anyway, they thought they would get some publicity out of it. They just happened to have, glory be, how did that happen, a leader writer from one of the tabloids with them. And of course the story came out in the paper. But we were actually able to avoid it. They went on stage, did a couple of numbers, then did a big protest, threw their gear all around and walked off. And left the audience not really quite knowing what was going on. They didn't really explain what their protest was in the venue itself. But it left them without a gig. They saw 2 numbers and that was it. And I had to go and apologise. But we managed to cover up by the next week doing 2 recordings on the same day and putting one out just after we'd recorded and then the next one the following week. So as far as fulfilling our broadcasting obligations, they were there. Although one of the artist wasn't the billed artist that was in Radio Times. Looking back now, you can see another reason why bands might well have chosen Rock Goes to College over a whistle testing concert, and that was the informality. The in concerts that we did were shot at the old BBC TV theatre in Shepherd's Bush, which was fine as far as most things were concerned, but it did mean an all-seating audience. And that works out if you're a Joni Mitchell or a Janice Ian or you're a laid-back band like Jackson Browne. But if you're sort of up and rocking, if you're a Johnny Winter or if you're a Leonard Skinner or if you're a Tom Petty, to have an audience that's sort of seated there must be a very difficult atmosphere to overcome. They wouldn't be used to that sort of thing. Whereas if you put them into a college situation with young kids standing and hooping and hollering as in the way that they normally would at a gig, you could see that they might very well feel very much at home. And so there was a degree of sort of tugging to and fro, and where possible we tried to fit the right sort of band into the right venue and the right occasion. Having said that, it didn't always work out. 2 that I remember which were definitely put into the wrong venue were the Cars and Steve Hillage. Now, as it happened, they followed each other 1 week after the next. And the Cars, who at that time were quite a bright spark coming out of Los Angeles, I put into Brighton University. And Steve Hillage went into Kent. And I realised when I arrived there that I got these 2 the wrong way round, because there in the Brighton Hall were a large number of somewhat hippie-like people with sort of Save Cannabis banners all over the place, and I'm sure they were selling cakes under the counter, though I didn't actually see it, but my impression was that. And Steve Hillage would have been an absolutely fabulous band for them to have, absolutely up their street, whereas the Cars, who were sort of all modern and techno, and were entirely the wrong one. And the week afterwards, Steve Hillage was in at Kent, and they were just ripe for a techno band like the Cars. So sometimes you get them right, sometimes you get them wrong. Luckily, we got them right more often than we got them wrong. Pleasurable as it was to do the sort of what I call whistle test offshoots, the concerts, primarily, for me, the most satisfactory programmes were the whistle tests, because here was an opportunity for us to actually show to people artists that they may have no other chance of seeing, particularly if they were out of the metropolitan area. Lots of bands used to fly in to do a promotional gig in the London area. They'd do whistle test, and then they'd fly out to Europe to do a single promotional gig in the different countries. And that meant that sort of the first time bands like Talking Heads, Blondie, Patti Smith, Tom Waits, Tom Petty, ZZ Top, Ricky Lee Jones, artists like that who became really well known in subsequent years. The first time they came in, the only opportunity that most people would have had to see them was on Whistle Test. And I always felt that it was the job of Whistle Test primarily to introduce people to artists and that for them to then make up their own mind. We were what used to be called by Melody Maker and NME in the old days to showcase them. Not a phrase I particularly like, but in fact that aptly describes what Whistle Test used to do to these artists. And it worked well for Whistle Test as well because they knew the value to them of appearing on the programme. So we used to get people of considerable stature in their own country who was trying to make it over here. And we got the opportunity, and really there was nowhere else they could be seen. Looking back now over the 15 years of Whistle Test, I realise what a great time it was for me, a very indulgent time. I mentioned before about showcasing bands, but with one exception that I'll come back to later. It was all a pleasurable thing to do because they were bands that I liked, they were music that I liked. And basically, I suppose you can say, to start with, what I like in music is some sort of melody. And that's a sort of giveaway in the title, the Old Grey Whistle Test, the idea that you can whistle the melody. And if there is no melody there, I find it much more difficult to enjoy. I did, on one occasion, choose a band that was suggested to me by one of the presenters, who shall remain nameless. I didn't particularly like the band, but I respected the guy who was telling me it, so you know it's not Annie. And I put them on, and I got a lot of shtick from viewers who didn't like the band either. They thought they were pretentious and a load of rubbish, basically what they were saying. And I found it very difficult to justify it because I personally felt that myself. So that was the one and only time that I went against my own feelings. Whether that was successful or not is really not for me to judge, but for the viewers through the years. But as we managed to keep going quite a long time, I guess I got it right some of the time. Again, with hindsight, I was having a good time. I was enjoying selecting music that was pleasurable to me. I suppose you could sort of think of Whistle Test as my toy. I think probably if I realised how seriously some people were taking it each week, tuning in at home, I might well have got scared and sort of lost my nerve. But as it was, I was, as I say, having a good time, and I had to put the thought that what I was doing was maybe making a band or breaking a band, disappointing a band, pleasing a band. I had to put this to the side and just say, if I was tuning in to watch Whistle Test this week, and this amount of music is the new music that's available, these bands are the bands that are either on tour or domestic bands that are available, and I make that choice, which ones would I choose to put on? Obviously, it's not a total ego trip. There was input from people working on the programme, there was input from presenters, there was input from viewers, and when we were doing simulcast, there was interest put in by producers in radio and also from listeners. But in the end, the buck has to stop somewhere, and the buck used to stop with me. It was a pleasurable buck. As I say, if I'd known and met some of the people who in later life said how they used to tune in regularly every Tuesday to watch the programme, I think I might well have run a mile and produced the epilogue or something. I still get a thrill when I see or hear artists who appeared on Whistle Test at the very beginning of their career, at the sort of bottom rung of the ladder, who in the intervening years have climbed right to the top and are now of sort of world status. I mean, people like Elton John, who came in the very, very early days when he and Bernie Taupin were just sort of starting out together. And it's a real thrill when you see they've, in Elton's case, honoured. But more than that, they've just achieved what you always hoped they might do and thought they might do. And I guess if I had to pick on one artist, rather like that person marooned on the desert island and who has to choose just one disc, I would have to go for Bruce Springsteen, not only for all the pleasure he's given me all through a number of years with his performances, but also for the fact that we were able to come in at a time in his career when in America he was just coming out of cult status into general recognition, but in the UK really wasn't known at all. It had started actually quite a few years before the time of his first tour over here, when the promotion people at CBS had been on at me. They were on at me actually about two artists at the same time. One was a guy called Jimmy Spheris, and the other was Bruce Springsteen. I don't know what happened to Jimmy Spheris. I think we all know what happened to Bruce Springsteen. When I was in the position that I was in those days, you had to be very careful that you didn't become a sort of pawn in the promotional game of chess that the departments in the various record companies were playing. And I was not exactly suspicious, but I was reticent initially about Bruce, basically because I hadn't seen him perform. And I think to this day, the secret of Bruce's success is his on-stage presence. I mean, songs are great and everything, but what is really special is his on-stage performance. I think of him, particularly in those early performances with the E Street Band, as being the sort of Laurence Olivier of rock and roll. He has that acting quality that on stage is absolutely mesmerising. I mean, not only does he give everybody their real money's worth, because he basically does two gigs, one either side of the interval, but he also has this ability of true communication, I think, in his introduction to his songs. Anyway, as I was saying, I was being sort of lectured by the promotional people, and I had the opportunity of going to see him with Bob in Los Angeles, performing on the Strip in a small club. And it was a sort of, right, everybody, this is me and this is how I perform. And I guess he was sort of up against it because the audience was full of faces, some from the world of rock and roll, some from cinema, but I mean, it was glittering. And he just had it, after probably the second song, he just had everybody in the palm of his hand. There was something, even there, when you were that close to him, there was something really special about that performance. And instantly, I saw what the guys at CBS had been saying to me and recognised that, this was something really special. And as a result, we arranged that Bruce would come over and he would do a couple of gigs at Hammersmith Odeon. And he would come in and do a concert at the Shepherd's Bush Theatre, the BBC Shepherd's Bush Theatre. And when he came over, we realised that the light levels which he operated were so low that there was no way we were going to get any real image on the electronic studio cameras that were operating in the theatre. It was still fairly early days in terms of technology, and we would have had to have put considerable more light on the band than they were prepared to allow. So we had to cancel that, but as a sort of compromise, we arranged for the gig to be filmed at the Hammersmith Odeon, and then we were going to, once edited, put that on as a replacement concert. Due to all sorts of problems with the breakup with his manager at the time, Mike Appel, and the classic rock and roll situation of the picture going one way and the soundtrack going another, and different people claiming the rights to different things. In fact, it never saw the light of day. Plus the fact that Bruce was unhappy with the gig. This, I think, was a false understanding of what the situation was. He was used to American audiences. This was the first time that he'd played outside of the US. And he was used to the whooping and hollering that goes on in American audiences, to my mind, in many cases, totally insensitive to the lyrics and what's happening. Just a way of getting off on somebody else's fame. And he had there an English or British audience that has a much more sensitive following and actually listens to the lyrics. But it does give you a feeling that there's a silence where normally there's shouting voices. And as a result, he felt the gig had not gone well. The combination of that and the breakup with Mike Appel and everything meant that what I'd hoped would be a sort of groundbreaking concert and an introduction to a British audience of what I considered to be something really special didn't happen until some considerable time later. Eventually, after pursuing him for a number of years, we got to a gig in the States, and Bob got to interview him, and we got to shoot some of the concert, rather more than they thought we were going to shoot, in fact, in the end. And that was, I think, in the UK, a beginning of a recognition of what the boss was about. I'm proud of the part that Whistle Test had to play in Bruce's acceptance in the UK. And I'm proud also of the fact that as a result of that first interview, we were given a second and then a third one. The last one incorporating a lot of live footage that was shot on Bruce's tour. It took us a long time to persuade him to accept Whistle Test's presence at one of his gigs, around about 7 years. But as a result of Bob's interviewing style, we got a good result from the interview, and Bruce and John, his manager by that time, John Landau, were very pleased. And this, I think, in the end, sort of led to the second interview. And the second interview was done by David Hepworth, who by that time had joined the programme, Bob had left. And David had the distinct advantage of, in my opinion, knowing more about Bruce than Bruce knew about himself. And this immediately put Bruce at ease. He got better and better and better until, in the end, his technique of being interviewed became a very easy one. And he became much more loquacious, and he had much more to say, and a much easier way of expressing himself. And I only say that I think Whistletest had quite a part to play in this because he actually didn't do many interviews at all at that time, hardly anything at all, and certainly not for television. We sort of had a stranglehold on him, or he chose for us to be the instrument through which he spoke to people. And this I find to this day a very happy association. He was always an extremely nice guy to get on with, no tantrums, none of the sort of I am a big star, you wait there until I'm ready type attitude. He was, I guess, a New Jersey boy. He was down to earth and not totally out of kilter with the lyrics of the songs he wrote. And in terms of his performances, for me anyway, I think they are some of the greatest I've ever seen, and I put him alongside Led Zeppelin at their height in the States, where they were like gods, and the Stones, who for me were one of the all-time, and still are, one of the all-time great rock and roll bands. And while we're on the subject of Led Zeppelin, they were actually responsible for my second appearance in the Old Grey Whistle Test. Having had those appearances during the first 2 weeks when Richard Williams was on honeymoon, I'd then gone back into the gallery, hopefully never to appear in public again. However, it just so happened that we had arranged for an interview with Robert Plant and Peter Grant, the manager, that Bob was due to do, and then he was stricken down with a throat infection, and Whispering Bob came totally inaudible Bob, and the only time that it could be done was at a specific time and a specific date. So I had to go and do it. At the time, Andrew Bailey was also working, and initially the idea was that he would do it, but he had to do a Buddy Holly interview for us in a totally different location. So I had to take it on my shoulders to do it. And, I mean, both of them were nothing short of gentlemen, and knew that this was me at a very inexperienced situation, and this was the time when they were the nearest thing to gods. Certainly in America, they were just lauded everywhere they went, ridiculously so. How they ever kept their feet on the ground, I don't know. Anyway, the interview was perfectly all right. It was to let us know exactly what was happening with Zeppelin. Somehow over the years, we'd sort of almost become the official mouthpiece for Zeppelin. Whenever they were going to do a tour, release an album or do anything, they let us know first, and in many cases would come on and do an interview. We had, I guess, a very good relationship going there. There's all sorts of rumours about the sort of heaviness of behind the band, and a lot of them, I'm quite sure, were well founded. You can't operate an operation like Led Zeppelin with the intensity that they had at that time without getting fairly heavy in certain areas. But I have to say that at no time across the board was Peter anything other than extremely friendly and pleasant to be with. And certainly the same goes for Robert, who was always a great friend. And in fact, on one of their American tours, Bob and I were over there filming at the time, and we went backstage with them, and it was just incredible to see the treatment that they got. They could almost do what they liked. I'm sure if they said they wanted the president to be deposed, certainly the rock and rollers in the audience would have gone straight out and done it. It was just amazing. Though in amongst all of it, I remember the thing that used to get Robert most of all, the thing he wanted most of all, was to get hold of the Pink 'Un, which was the sports paper in the Birmingham area. And I can't remember actually exactly which football team it was that he supported, but it was one of the Midland teams, and that was of primary importance. If they were having parties, if they were having rehearsals, whatever it was, the pinking came first. And as a supporter of another football team, not in the Midlands, I was interested to see the results as well, but he was fanatical about them. I remember another occasion with Zeppelin. It was prior to an American tour, and they were playing some gigs in Europe, and I went out to Montreux. They were doing a gig in Montreux. It was like one of those legendary small gigs in a small venue by a major band, like the Stones playing the Marquee or like that. And this was a small gig that I don't think exists any longer in Montreux. And after it was over and the crowd had dispersed, we all decided we'd go up a mountain to a restaurant that we'd been into once before. And so we all crowded into a couple of cars, and because I'd been there before, I went in the lead car to show the way, which was okay, except that I'd only been there once before. It was very high up this mountain, above the snow line, and this was in the summertime. So it was a long way up, and there were several sort of forks in the road. And about 2/3 into the journey, I began to panic slightly that maybe this wasn't the right way. It was roughly the right direction because we were going up a mountain, but whether this was actually the road on which the restaurant stood, I was beginning to have doubts. And the guy from Atlantic Records, who was there as well with the band, who had entrusted me with the directions, also began to panic. And luckily we were both in the front car and the band were in the car behind. Anyway, eventually we did a slight detour and got onto the right road again and got to the restaurant, and it was deserted, which we'd expect because it was, as I say, a long way up. We got there and asked for a menu, and they said, oh no, there's no menu. You can have raclette, which is a melted cheese on boiled potatoes. You literally have a great cheese handed to you, and you melt some in front of an open fire, let it drop onto the potatoes, and then pass it on to the next person who does the same, which is all right, but it's not the most wonderful meal. And then for a pudding, the only thing that was there were cherries in alcohol, these big bottles of it, or horns of cream. The horns were slightly old pastry. The cream was totally unflavoured, so there was no flavour at all to that. And the cherries in alcohol, all the flavour had gone out of the cherries into the alcohol, which two of the roadies promptly drank all the alcohol out of the bottles, handed them back. And they were, I say bottles, they were big jars, handed back these tasteless cherries and gave them around to everybody to eat with these tasteless horns of cream. And so we all got out as fast as we could. And the problem was there were only two cars, so you had to wait till the last person was ready to go. We got into the cars, and then about halfway down, the brakes gave out on one of the cars. And we managed to get down there by wearing out the handbrakes. The foot brakes gave out. But by the time we got to the mountain, the handbrake was almost totally worn down. So it was quite an episode, and there were some not too happy people around. And particularly as Zeppelin very, very rarely had brought their wives along as well. So it wasn't as if they were dying to get back to pick up some groupies or anything, because they were on their best behaviour. I mentioned Montreux relationship to Zeppelin, but it actually has quite a long, recent past association with music, both jazz and the famous Montreux Jazz Festival, which is world-renowned, but also an awful lot of rock and roll went on there in one way and another. And the Stones used to go there for pre-rehearsals when they were about to go off on tour to the States. And I remember at the end of the first Whistle Test series, which would have been sometime round about June 1972, they were rehearsing there. And we were invited, along with Mike Leckerbusch, who was a producer of a German rock program at that time. We were both invited to go over there if we wanted to, shoot some film of them in rehearsal and interview them, which we duly did, and that was transmitted in the last program of that first Whistle Test series. But the ironic thing was that after we'd done the filming, which was done in a now non-existent cinema, it's been pulled down since, but it was a little cinema in one of the back streets, And the other side of the street from the cinema was a cafe stroke music club. And we went over there for a drink afterwards. And there was this little group, a quartet of Italians, playing on a sort of electronic organ, guitars, drums and things. Medleys of different music, from A Walk in the Black Forest and things like that. Suddenly they struck up a whole sequence of Rolling Stones songs, and the audience were made up of quite young people, all went wild. And I thought, if only they knew that 50 feet across the other side of the street was the real thing, playing the real music, and yet they were going wild over this really rather poor imitation. I also remember going to Frankfurt to see the Stones. We were doing an interview with Mick for the programme, and they were playing this enormous Sportshalle there. I can't remember the actual name of the venue, but it was vast, and it had this great high ceiling, like a dome. Maybe that's where they got the idea of the London Dome. Anyway, this dome was supported by metal arches, and throughout most of the gig there was a German fan walking around at this enormous height. I don't know what he was on, but whatever it was, it had sent him up there. And it was so distracting that half the audience was spending their time craning their necks looking up at this man. And gradually the band realised something was going on, and they all ended up playing and singing, but their heads inverted, looking up to the top at this guy. He never fell down, and where he went at the end I don't know. But for many people he destroyed the atmosphere of the gig. Although I'm sure he wasn't aware of it, in many ways that guy walking around in the ceiling, way up above the Stones, was in fact an omen for things that were to come. The bands like the Stones, like Elton, like Queen, ELP, Yes, all those large bands were gradually getting further and further away from their audiences, mostly physically. I mean, there was a great gap between the front of the stage and the audience, and it was getting wider and wider. And where in the early days of rock and roll there had almost been no gap at all, gradually the superstars were becoming superstars and the proletariat were withdrawing further and further into the theatre. And this had a limited lifestyle. I suppose anybody who's really stood back and looked at it would realise that something had to happen. And what happened was the punk movement. The punk movement came in with enormous violence, enormous vigour, enormous energy. In many cases, not too much musical association, but what it was a revolution, and revolutionaries don't follow the same patterns that were around at the time. It was, for Whistletest, a fairly uncomfortable period, really. We had established ourselves as an album programme. In fact, that was our raison d'etre. I mean, we were there to play album music, Top of the Pops was there to play singles music. And for all those who remember the early days of punk, it was totally tied down to a singles revolution. Album became a dirty word. And with it, I suppose, we became almost dinosaurs in the eyes of these young people. And we got quite a lot of stick for it. And in some ways I understand, because we've been the programme that have been championing young bands and pushing new material. And suddenly here comes a whole wave that wasn't appearing on the programme. But they didn't actually fit the agenda that had been set for the programme. I suppose one could say that we should have changed our agenda, but I don't actually believe that. I think we were an album programme. If albums had stopped being manufactured, then obviously we would have gone with the new wave. But they hadn't. There were plenty of albums coming around, and all I was doing was waiting for any of the punk bands to bring out albums themselves which would make them eligible for the programme. And that wasn't going to happen initially because the whole revolution was singles-led. So, as I say, we were slightly sidelined for a while. Plus the fact that, there were other programmes that could come along. I mean, we didn't have a franchise on the only music that was going on television. There was nothing to stop anybody on either ITV or other BBC programmes bringing out a new programme which could highlight and feature only the punk movement. Nobody seemed to want to do it initially, although there was a good programme that came out of Manchester called So It Goes, and in a way So It Goes became the champions of this movement. And for my money, it was a good thing because what it meant was there was a greater breadth of music, of rock and roll of various forms on television. At the same time, Bob, who'd sort of not, I think, been a great fan of the punk movement, don't say he denies every punk band had any quality. I'm sure he wouldn't do that. I'm sure there were some that did appeal to him. But by and large, it wasn't a movement that was simpatico with Bob. It wasn't particularly simpatico with me either. We'd always been, as the title of the programme says, the Old Grey Whistle Test, the idea was that you could whistle a melody. A melody had been very much in our minds and our choice of bands that appeared on the programme, and suddenly here was this raw energy and gobbing and spitting and sort of fairly antisocial behaviour, which was, I suppose, a bit of a shock for the dinosaurs that were around. Anyway, there was a schism, without a doubt, and Bob and Whistle Test really were on one side, and this young movement was on the other side. Inside the movement, there was obviously a lot of talent that was going to come through in the long run, and there were also bands that were new at the time that either latched onto or were put in the same box as the punk movement, bands like the Police and Elvis Costello, who I don't really think were punk bands. I mean, they actually probably benefited from it, but in the long run, they lived through the punk era and became massive stars in their own right, and I think they would have done that whatever happened. Anyway, as I said, Bob was less than happy with things. I mean, he was even set on in a club by a member of a punk band, and I just generally feel he felt disheartened at the time. And it came at a time when he was wanting to do some other things in radio and writing and things, and so rather like Richard Williams, after the first series had decided he was going down a journalistic and writing path for the future, so Bob decided that he would sort of keep up with his radio work, but for the moment anyway, would part from television. And so it was up to me to sort of look around and find a new presenter. And I set the same criteria as I'd always done. Principally, the person has to be a journalist first and a broadcaster second. And somebody who fitted this bill, was very popular with the younger audience, was Annie Nightingale. She was writing, she had a column for the Express, and she had a radio programme on Radio 1. And it was a good time to introduce a sort of female into the Whistle Test company, where really there hadn't been one before. The first punk band to actually play live on the programme actually appeared slightly earlier than they were due to an accident. The American band Chicago was due to tour in the UK in February of '78, and it was all going ahead. They were booked for the programme when Terry Kath, the lead guitarist, was killed in a shooting accident. He had a gun that he was playing around with. He thought it was unloaded. It wasn't, and he shot himself in the head and died. And as a consequence, T.V. Smith and the Adverts stepped into the breach at the last moment and became the first recognised punk band to play live on the programme. It was inevitable it was going to happen because the punk bands were by then embracing the album market, and we were fairly bruised and battered, but not having sort of featured any of them up until that time. As soon as the albums were around, we ran tracks and things, but actually T.V. Smith was the first one to play live, and we sort of welcomed it. And with a fair degree of irony, Tim Smith stepped up to the microphone and said, "At last, the 1978 show," and went straight off into his first number. And some of the brickbats that had been thrown at us were sort of taken back, I think. T.V. Smith and the Adverts opened the doors to other punk bands, and gradually they appeared more and more on the programme. I always remember at the time, though, that people were always talking about energy. Energy was the buzzword of the moment. There was very little talk about music. It was protest, it was energy, it was pogoing, it was all the accoutrements of the punk movement, the sort of political side of it, where the strength was. And then gradually, the ones who had decided they wanted a career in the music business moved away slightly, and their musicianship came through. Some stayed as a protest movement, and others just fell by the wayside because they'd made their process, they'd done their thing. They'd never designed their careers to be album material bands. They'd had a good time and got on with the other things of life. And out of the movement came some very good bands. But the other thing was that it was, in many ways, very damaging to the other section of the dinosaurs in the business, and that was the major record companies. Because this singles criteria that the punk movement was based on was very much also based on small independent labels, the people who could actually produce the singles. And so a lot of the money that had been going into the larger record companies was suddenly diverted into these small companies. And where the majors had had all the money from the market, and it was a vast sum in those days, because as I said earlier, there was very little else for kids to spend their relaxation money on. Suddenly they felt a squeeze, and you could see people being laid off where more than necessary were being employed in, say, promotion departments. Suddenly there were cutbacks, and it was the beginning of the scaling down of the music business as we know it today. They'd ruled the roost for such a long time and created such an enormous companies on the profits, and suddenly the squeeze was there. And although the punk movement withered and died, as most movements that come through with such rapidity like that do, most revolutions have to die down one way or the other. They either win through or they fall by the wayside. Once the punk movement had gone, it left a lot of scarred record companies who, to this day, have never fully recovered. Many people might well say that actually what it did was focus the major record companies on thinking about what they were doing, because up to that time they'd been able pretty well to do what they liked because there's so much money slushing around. While the record companies were taking stock of the situation and bearing in mind what was happening with the independent labels scaling down their personnel, we seemed to be expanding. Not so much just as Whistletest, but expanding into other areas, like specials, like Rock Around the Clock, Christmas Eve concerts. We used to do a live Christmas Eve concert, and then we'd do our New Year's Eve Pick of the Year, which sometimes incorporated a live concert as well, like the Blondie concert from Scotland. And it was becoming difficult for the small team that was running Whistletest to do all of this, plus the fact that I personally had other duties to take on within the department, looking after other programs as well. And so we decided that the time had come to have a two-team set-up, where one team could be on one week, one team could be on the next week. So there was a week of preparation, a week of production. And John Burrows, who'd been directing with us for a considerable time, headed up one team, and Trevor Dan came over from radio to head up the other team. And I took an editorial position rather than just straight producer. This meant that I could sit back and plan other peripheral programs without it being to the detriment of Whistletest. And we expanded into a number of different areas, some of which were not pure music, but discussion about music, in a way reverting to the original concept of Whistletest as a sort of NME stroke melody maker of the air. Among the programs that came out of our area were 8 days a week, and the people involved with that also produced Pop Quiz, the first series of Pop Quiz. We had a young arts program that came from the Riverside Studios in Hammersmith and had the eponymous title of Riverside. And of course we had other specials like, I suppose the major one was obviously Live Aid, but we also were responsible for the Nelson Mandela concert, the first one, while he was still in prison. And a number of documentaries from people like the Stones, ZZ Top, Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen. So there was quite a lot coming out of the Whistletest stable. What had started off as a small program in the smallest studio and television centre had expanded in its own way into a little empire all of its own. At the same time as we expanded into a two-team production unit, we also decided that we should change the name of the programme. This was something that the two new producers were quite keen to do. For a long time, the Old Grey Whistletest had been shortened to Whistletest. everybody called it Whistle Test, and it seemed to us that here was an obvious change of title which would retain the feeling of the programme, it would retain the association of the programme in people's minds, but it would just give it a little fillip, it would be slightly different. And it would reflect any changes that we brought into play at this time. All through its life, Whistle Test had evolved. If you look at the first Whistle Test compared to the last Whistle Test before it changed its title, it was very radically different. But because it was an evolutionary situation, people didn't really notice particularly. And at sometimes I suspect would say that it hadn't changed at all, but it's like all evolutionary things. The change is so gradual you don't notice it until you actually compare chunks that are distance from each other. And undoubtedly Whistle Test had become a very different programme. We changed our opening title sequence, so the star kicker, who was sort of like our signature and so associated with the programme, virtually disappeared. It was kept on just slightly, but it certainly didn't have the predominance that it had at that time. We changed the theme tune, so Stone Fox Chase, again, which had been so associated with the programme for so many years, that went out the window as well. And we changed our presenters. Annie left, and in her place came David Hepworth, who had been appearing on the programme doing reports into the previous series, so he had actually worked alongside Annie. So although there was a major change, there was a degree of continuity still there. And he was joined by Mark Ellen, who at the time was working on Smash Hits, and Andy Kershaw, who had, just prior to coming to work on Whistle Test, been the roadie with Billy Bragg. And it was while one of the teams were filming with Billy Bragg in Paris, they met Andy and got talking, and as a result he joined the Whistle Test stable. The other two who came in at this time were Richard Skinner, who did a news report each week and a rundown of the charts, and Paul Gambaccini, well-known rock aficionado, who did his own reports on events that were happening around. And I suppose the most radical of all changes, we introduced an audience. We'd had audiences for Whistle Test specials, concerts and things, but we'd never had one for the Whistle Test programme straight as it had been. I had a degree of reservation about introducing an audience. I could see that it was a major improvement for interaction for the bands that were playing live. But I thought from the audience's point of view in the studio, there were long periods where there were editorial sequences going on, interviews and filmed reports that really were not enormously entertaining to be sitting in a studio for. I mean, at home you get the close-up and you get the illustrations and things, but they would be sitting in an audience looking up at monitors strung up from the ceiling in a slightly more uncomfortable way than they would be at home. But undoubtedly, I think it was worth it in the long run, because it did make the bands feel more at home. They had something to play to rather than the cold studio. And although some people might have thought maybe this detracted for the bands playing for the audience at home, I think what would happen in the long run is you get a better performance out of the band, and that benefited everybody. One of the pitfalls of introducing an audience was that they got their tickets via applications to the BBC ticket unit. And the applications were sort of issued on a first-come, first-served basis and not really related to the content of the programme. It was to come and see a television programme being made, which in principle works out quite well, but it doesn't always work out. And we had one occasion where a coachload of elderly matrons from the Midlands suddenly appeared in the Whistle Test audience. And everybody was sort of whispering, what's that? What's happening? Who's that? And we couldn't make out what was happening. In fact, they probably had applied to go and see Val Dunicum, but had got tickets for Whistle Test. And I always remember the horror on their faces when the first band started playing. And as soon as the session had finished and we'd gone into the first pre-recording, it was a film interview, they all got up and trooped out as quickly as possible. And as a result of that, we developed a close relationship with the ticket unit and had some influence into exactly who was given the tickets. And in fact, we sort of asked people to apply. If they wanted to come and see the programme, we asked them to apply and to specify that they wanted to come and see Whistle Test. And we never had that mix-up again. although we had that slight problem with the audience, by and large, over the years, there was very little that went wrong on Whistle Test. We had our moments, but they were few and far between. Meatloaf, I remember, as one. I'd been down at the Meadem Festival, which was a music festival music publishers festival in the south of France. It still goes on now today. And I was walking around the various stands, and I saw a whole crowd standing around one, and I sort of sidled up to see what it was. And there was this very large guy giving a performance of a lifetime, singing something that sounded like Bat Out of Hell. So I hung around afterwards to find out about it and have another viewing of it on my own, and decided it was so sensational that I had to have it in Whistle Test the next Tuesday. So I grabbed the only copy that was around, got on the plane and flew back for the programme, put it on the programme, and the next day the furore that had been around the stand at Meadem was around the record shops as people went out and clamoured to buy the thing. And then a while later, he came on the programme, the band came on the programme, and all my support and everything was repaid by him using expletives, which at that particular time, although Ken Tynan was known for it, was actually almost unknown on television, and certainly was not to be tolerated, it would seem, on BBC Two's Premier Rock Show. Anyway, I was summoned up the next day by the controller of BBC Two, saying what the hell did I think was going on. He was not going to have this sort of language on the channel, and if anything like this happened again or continued, then Whistle Test would be taken off the air. I remember at the time thinking, at least it's nice to know that the hierarchy of the BBC actually watched the programme, because we had such an autonomous life over there doing an awful lot of what we wanted to do on our own, that one at times began to think that maybe we were actually broadcasting to everybody but those in the BBC. Anyway, the outcome was that mostly people behave perfectly well. You give them responsibility, they act responsibly. You treat them like children, they'll react like children. But we did have another notorious occasion, although notorious is not really the right word, with Bad Company. This was one of our New Year's Eve Pick of the Year specials. Every New Year's Eve we used to put together a pick of the best performances of the previous year and put it into about a 90-minute programme, but we surrounded it with some live acts and things going on to make it a New Year's Eve. And we had live in the studio, for the first time, Bad Company. Now, Bad Company were a band that had a particular sound, and I suppose I hadn't really fully assessed what was needed to get this sound, because it was actually achieved by distorting through volume the amps and the speakers that they played through. And what happened was they came into the studio and they started playing, and the sides of the studio seemed to be sort of going in and out with the walls of the speaker. The cameramen sort of down tools and said, look, we can't do this, it's making us physically ill. We're about to be sick because it's hitting our stomachs, the volume of sound. And I spoke to the band, and the band said, well, look, there's nothing we can do about it. We can't get our sound if we don't play at that volume. And so we had, in the end, to come to a mutual agreement that they wouldn't play on the programme, because, I mean, I had a certain degree of sympathy with them. You know, if you have a sound, then you want to recreate that sound. If you don't recreate that sound, it doesn't work well for the programme either. With hindsight, I should have asked them to bring in those little, if you know them, little pig nose speakers, because you could actually distort those without such a high volume, and we could have got the right sound. So we parted amicably, but it was a really sort of difficult programme initially, because this was with about 20 minutes to go to midnight, and we had to suddenly rush around the other bands, and I remember Ace were playing and Leo Sayer was playing, and I had to ask them to do an extra number, which we wouldn't have time to rehearse, and then I asked Ace if they would do a couple of extra numbers. We just about got on the air on time, and we'd actually set that particular programme in what looked like a disused studio that had been left for the Christmas holidays and New Year holidays. And Bob was to do his opening link coming out of the TARDIS, the Doctor Who TARDIS, which happened to be in the studio. And we went on air and cut to the TARDIS. Bob came out and did his piece to camera, which was quite a long piece to camera. And at the end of it, we went into the first number, and he'd slightly deviated from the script, and I was annoyed about it because we were very tight, and we really didn't need any deviations with all the trouble we'd had. So I went down to him and said, "Look, what the heck's going on?" And there he was, as white as a sheet, and he walked out of the TARDIS, and the autocue, which is the prompter that has all the lines and words on it, wasn't working. And in fact, he'd done from memory the link that was so close that I hadn't realised the autocue had broken down. And instead of telling him off, I should have been bowing and scraping before him for giving such an impeccable performance, considering he had no prompter in front of him, and it all had to be done from memory when that wasn't what was required of him. Autocue is of great assistance to some, but it can also be a problem to others, and it's not always to everybody's liking. I mean, you must have seen people with their eyes going left to right, and realising that they're being prompted in some way. Mostly, I think the whistle test presenters worked really well with autocue, though sometimes they were upstaged by bands like the Damned. You'll see in their extract how they're playing with Annie, because they're standing beside her and sort of reading the autocue at the same time as she is, which is A, slightly off-putting, and B, gives away the fact that an autocue is being used, whereas obviously one tries to disguise it as much as possible. The Damned had obviously decided that this was going to be a somewhat disruptive performance and a little bit of anarchy out at Shepperton Studios, where we were operating at the time. The programme was coming from the Who's stage out there. Anyway, Annie, I think, coped with it very well, and the band did their number and decided that it was time to smash up the studio and smash up everything. And there they were, doing their best to be as anarchic as possible. But the problem is that really they look rather like anarchists in Democrats' clothing. It's more a cartoon in the style of Scooby-Doo than any sort of frightening thing going on. Persuading rock stars of a sort of major world standing to appear on the programme was at times a problem. They were less inclined to want to promote their material than the up-and-coming bands who needed the exposure. And we had two quite amusing occasions, two people we were after. One was Jeff Beck, and the other was Eric Clapton. And we wanted to do an interview with Jeff. It was nothing more than that. And I guess he had plenty of other things to do and he wasn't that interested. So he agreed to do the interview, but only if Judd Lander, who was the promotion guy for his record company, who happened to be also a musician and played bagpipes and mouth organs and all sorts of instruments, as well as being a very good illusionist. He agreed to do the interview, but only on the understanding that Judd would march up and down, totally naked, playing the bagpipes in the background. And Judd, being the guy he was, said, "Yeah, I'm a promotion man and I'll promote." He said he would do it. Jeff, good to his word, came in, and we have this interview with Judd marching discreetly up and down in the background with things placed strategically so that it was not offensive to anybody, but at the same time was quite amusing. And the other person we were working on for quite a long time to come on was Eric Clapton. Eric was going through a period where he was very much keeping himself in the shadows, in the background. He was not performing a lot. He was sometimes playing with other people, but he certainly wasn't taking a leading role. And I, for one, was missing those wonderful riffs that he plays. And I was hoping that we could persuade him in some way to come onto the programme. And the opportunity came when there was a visiting artist from the States playing in the studio, one that he was either a friend or he liked the music. And Eric came in to the studio to see the performance. And afterwards, the party was thrown for this guy. Stephen Bishop it was, actually. And it was held at a restaurant in Notting Hill Gate in London called Julie's. And they have this room at the back which has an enormous Arthurian-type round table, although actually it's oval more than round. And we were all sitting round this, a whole crowd of us. And after we'd had a drink or two and a bite to eat, and we were sort of all feeling rather happy, I asked Eric what were the chances of him coming on the programme. And he hadn't done anything on television in ages. And he said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not really into it very much at the moment." And I said, "Well, what would it take to persuade you?" And he said, "Well, I tell you what, you stand up and tell everybody a joke, and if they laugh at the end of the joke, I'll come in and do the programme." So I had to very quickly try and think of a joke, and it's amazing how your mind empties of jokes the moment you're put on the spot. Anyway, I pulled one out of the recesses at the back of my mind, and I stood up and told it, and I'm not one really given to standing up in public and telling jokes. Anyway, I thought this was worth the sacrifice, and if I fell flat on my face, it would be worthwhile just in case I get him. And it went down reasonably well, and he came round as we were all leaving, and he said, "Right, phone my manager in the morning and we'll arrange for a date to come in." And that became a Whistle Test special. And it was the first performance really he'd done for a very long time, shot at the Shepherd's Bush Theatre. There were plenty of happy memories, but after 16 years of broadcasting, the writing was seemingly on the wall for Whistle Test. The department called Network Features, which spawned the programme, was being split up in a management shake-up. It was a somewhat cosmetic thing because everybody was going into different departments, and all we were losing, in fact, was the name Network Features. But it did mean that we were in danger of losing that autonomy which had been so vital to our existence through the years. Against all odds, we'd survived the period of punk. We peaked with Live Aid, which was put together by the Whistle Test team. And in a way, I suppose, we'd exhausted our territory. There was a new type of music beginning to come in, which was dance music, which was club-oriented, and for my money, not as successful on television as the music that had come before it. Great in clubs and great to dance to, but as a spectacle, for me anyway, less satisfactory. And so it seemed that we should retire gracefully, rather than go out with a whimper and drag on until somebody decided to put us out of our misery. We were on a high, things were successful, and it always seems to me that that's the best time to quit the arena. It's amazing, looking back, to think that it's 30 years since the first Whistle Test broadcast in that tiny studio up in the 4th floor of the Television Centre. And personally, I'm delighted that the BBC has done this retrospective DVD to mark the occasion. For me, looking back at the programming that's involved in this disc, it stands up so well. I was expecting it to all look dated. I mean, there are bits that do, but by and large, it stands up extremely well, and it's really enjoyable. And how they were able to choose from 16 years of programming and narrow it down to the performance they've got, I don't know. It must have been amazingly difficult. But I have to say, having looked through it and enjoyed it enormously and have really had good fun looking at it, I had to decide for myself which of the performances I would take if I was asked which one I would take on my desert island and which is the special one I would have at the end. I decided, looking through, that the one I would choose would be a beautiful song that was written by an American composer called Fred Neil. It's a song called The Dolphins, and it's sung exquisitely, I think, by the late Tim Buckley. There's very little that I know of Tim Buckley in a recorded condition. I've never seen anything other than this. And one performance from years before on a BBC programme called Late Night Lineup. But this performance of the Dolphins, I think, is really moving and really memorable. And I'm so glad they included it. I hope, like me, when you watch this DVD, you will get the enjoyment that I got out of it. You will probably have another artist that you choose as your favourite. But whatever it is, I hope it's as much fun for you, and it brings back as many memories as it did for me watching it. Memories not only of the artists, not only their songs, not only their performances, but memories of nights huddled around the television set watching the Old Grey Whistle Test.